that's not our jurisdiction, or there's no silver
You've
bullet.
never read the Constitution.
You are going to get... wah, wah, wah. Add sound effect editing, Liam.
Hi, I'm Jacob Kent.
And I'm Liam McPherson.
It's the newest edition of your sheriff's favorite podcast. It's Speech from the Throne, Episode 6.
We're here to bring you the latest and greatest from the halls of power.
But not with another low-energy budget takedown. We're just here to argue. Hey, Liam, what are we talking about today?
Well, Jacob, before we get into the nitty-gritty of today, I just want to do our typical disclosure that we are both Canadian federal public servants. Our views and opinions expressed in this podcast are ours alone and do not reflect the opinion of the Government of Canada.
Oh, must be a spicy take if you have to start it off with this.
This one, to warn you viewers, is going to be a little bit of a heavy episode. We're going to be talking about, in part, the 2020 Nova Scotia shootings, the worst mass shooting in Canadian history. At times, I will be outlining details of certain crimes during this shooting, some of which may be disturbing. So if that's not your thing, you can skip forward to when Jacob and I unpack the political issues and possible solutions to this, to some of the problems that cause these crimes. So basically, to give you a brief overview, 22 people were murdered over the course of April 18th and 19th, 2020, by one man parading around most of the time in a replica cruiser, a replica RCMP cruiser that he had deckled himself. So it's just, I mean, that in itself is beyond the pale. It was horrific. I remember... I don't know when what you remember about the shootings when they broke, but when the news broke, I was in my apartment with my partner, who I like. We had just started dating, and we turned on the news. Or I turned on the news because I'm a news junkie, obviously, and that was what I saw, and I just remember being flabbergasted. And to get into it, basically, this guy was able to rampage across central Nova Scotia towards the Halifax Regional Municipality, pretty much at will over the course of 2 days. And I'll walk you through sort of a Reader's Digest version of events. There are some nuances I'm going to leave out. If you want more detail than me, check out the reporting by Tim over at the Halifax Examiner. He's done an excellent job covering this. And the reason this, you're wondering, why are we talking about this? Why, this happened 2 years ago. There's a public inquiry happening right now in the province of Nova Scotia into how this was not only obviously allowed, but able to happen. And it, after a few, false starts and bureaucratic red tape incidents, it finally got off to a delayed start. It was supposed to happen last year. It's now happening. And Tim and the Halifax Examiner team are doing a great job. And so they've got your nuances, but here's the Reader's Digest version. The killer, I'm not going to name him, got in a domestic fight. There was a domestic incident with his partner. And this was April 18th in Portapique, where the killer had a property. They had a domestic dispute, which escalated to the point where he attempted to handcuff her and confine her in the back of his replica RCMP car over at a warehouse property near his. After which she managed to flee into the woods. He torched both the properties, and unfortunately, the first thing that he did is go over to the house of the Blair family. That's Jamie and Greg Blair and their two kids. He shot Greg on the deck, shot Jamie in the bedroom. The kids escaped to the McCulley residence. Lisa McCulley's children answered the door. Lisa McCulley went out to help. She was shot on her property, fatally shot. And he proceeded to kill a bunch of his neighbors. And, they include Frank and Don Gullinchin, Joanne Thomas and John Zoll, Corey Ellison, Joy and Peter Bond, Jolene Oliver, Aaron Tuck, and their daughter Emily Tuck. And most of these people were killed in their homes, and these homes were subsequently torched. Now, 3 Mounties arrived on scene and tried to suss out where the gunman could have gone, but they didn't know that there was a road out of the community that wasn't on their maps that the locals called the Blueberry Field Road, because it went through went through a blueberry field. It was a privately owned road, but the gunman knew about it and he escaped that way. He subsequently, and most bizarrely, went to Debert, Nova Scotia, which is somewhere near Truro, Nova Scotia. I don't know how well people know Nova Scotia geography, but central Nova Scotia. Sits in a business park overnight. Just sits there overnight, all night. No one finds him, despite the fact that multiple witnesses and victims survivors, I should say, told the police that he was driving a replica police car. Now, the next morning, the killer left Debert. He sort of headed towards kind of the Wentworth Valley, which is part of the Appalachian Mountain Range. And he drives into that sort of area, and he hits up 2328 Hunter Road, which is on the Wallace River. That's the home of Alana Jenkins and Sean McLeod, who were subsequently murdered by the perpetrator. After that happened, he set the house on fire, and as was his normal sort of thing, he continued to rampage through Wentworth, through Glenholm. There was a man at one of the crime scenes, Tom Bagley, that went to help, and he was a retired firefighter, so he went to help and put out the fire, and the killer murdered him. There was a woman out for her morning walk that was murdered on the side of the road. A woman bringing coffee to her daughters was pulled over by the killer and shot in her car. Another woman who was a nurse going from client to client house, like she was a continuing care nurse, going from client to client's house. She was murdered in her car by the gunman, and he continued on to the Plains Road in Debert, back in Debert, where this is after he left the Plains Road. He's coming out of Debert into Onslow, which is right by one of the main highways in Nova Scotia, the 102, and drove right by it. And two cops noticed. Two Mounties were talking. Westlake's not a Mountie. Westlake is he worked with the Mounties in an emergency capacity, and he had worked with the Mounties in other emergency situations, but he didn't belong to the force. And so this guy Westlake was talking to Constable Gagnon, and Westlake turned and noticed this RCMP cruiser drive by with a push bar. He goes, "That's funny. There's only one I know of in the province. It's very rare in Nova Scotia to see an RCMP cruiser with a push bar." But he kind of silently noted it, and he's like, "Well, that's not a big deal. Like, there's a lot of Mounties around here," because the Mounties were at the Onslow Fire Hall taking care of some of the Portapique evacuees. And about not too long after that, there was nearly a blue-on-blue, police-on-police shooting because of an error, and I'll get into that later. But this killer keeps going. He goes up the 102 towards Halifax to Shubenacadie. He kills. There was a Mountie that tried to intervene, Chad Morrison, who was subsequently shot. And then after this happened, Heidi Stevenson, another Mountie, was hit head-on by this guy. She was subsequently killed. There was a man who pulled over next to the wrecks because he lit the cars on fire, who tried to come out to help. He put him in the back of his car, killed him. Went to the home of a woman, Gina Goulet, who was subsequently murdered, took her car, continued driving to Enfield, which is just on the outskirts of Halifax, listeners, and that's how close he was, but he had to get gas because Gina Goulet's car was low on gas. He had to go get some. So he pulled over to get gas. He was kind of rubbing his head wound because the Mountie that he murdered managed to wound him in the head. And there were two Mounties completely coincidentally that happened to be there filling up. They'd been looking for him, but they didn't know that he was there. They thought he was further back up the 102. They turned and they noticed this guy with the head wound, and they managed to kill him. So that brought an end to the rampage, but you have to understand this happened over 2 days, which is highly I don't know, like if it's never happened before, but to me that's highly unusual, at least as from a layman's perspective. And there were a number of failures on the part of the RCMP leading in the midst of the event and after the incident, several of which I think and others think would have saved lives had they not happened. And the most important one is the replica car, the replica RCMP cruiser. The Mounties knew who the guy was, the killer, knew his name. knew his description, shared it with the public, all before they shared with the public that he was dressed as a cop and was driving a replica cruiser. Now, this normally wouldn't have been as much of an issue if they had been finding this out sort of on the fly, but the reality was that the first person to tell the Mounties about the replica car were victims the night of April 18th in Portapique, survivors. And then the next morning when the killer's partner came out of the woods, luckily safe, very injured, but safe, she confirmed that as well. She said, down to the lights, down to the light bar. It's a replica RCMP cruiser. The RCMP didn't share that information with the public until 10:21 a.m. It had been recommended by Heidi Stevenson sometime between 9 and 10 a.m. As a possible measure to take. She was the officer that was subsequently murdered. And it went up the approval chain, and then they came back and they said, no, we're not going to let people know yet. But not really any justification why, but we're not going to let people know that just yet. And by that time, by the time 10:21 rolled around and they decided to put out a tweet about it after all, there had already been several more murders that morning, that 2328 Hunter Road, Wentworth, Glenholm, Plains Road into Burt. It's and it was later confirmed that a lot of these people that were murdered the morning of April 19th were aware of the Portapique incident from the night before, had been following the coverage, and even knew the killer's name and description. Had they been able to get the information out there about the replica police car sooner, it could have saved lives, I think. Another major blunder was the fact that the emergency broadcast system was not activated. So everybody knows that. That's when they turn on their TV or they pick up their phone and there's a big old, it's almost like the same system as the Amber Alert, warning people that there's something going on that begs of their concern. That was not activated once. My grandmother lives in Glenholm, my nan, and she had no idea what was going on, despite the killer being quite close to her. She lives in Glenholm. One of the murders took place there. And she had to find out by calling her neighbor to ask what was going on when she saw a ghost car of the RCMP's racing down her road with the lights on. She had to call her neighbor. She said, Didn't you hear? There's a killer on the loose. Like, you got to get down in your basement and hide. And she hid, and she was fine.
Oh,
but
my goodness.
if she usually watches television that morning and eats her cereal, and she would have seen the emergency broadcast alert. It was not activated. Nobody really knows why. I'm sure we'll find out. That's what the public inquiry is for. But another blunder. Now, not only were the public misinformed about certain details about this guy, it was some Mounties that weren't in the know about this guy. They knew that they were looking for a guy. They thought maybe he was driving a white Ford Taurus. Or possibly there were a couple other models suggested that weren't correct, but like one of them was a white Ford Taurus, which is identical to the Ford Interceptors that the Mounties drive. They're just a juiced Taurus. And basically, they went from a white Ford Taurus to possibly a decommissioned police car, which some officers who weren't in the know theorized that maybe he bought it at an auction, so maybe it had some of the decals left or some of the coloring left or like the paint scheme. But this wasn't true either. Despite the fact that the Mounties had been told directly by witnesses that he was in a car that looked like an RCMP car. Like it was an RCMP car. It had the stickers. It had, and so that was
to believe it.
Right. And so that was a big thing. And when the killer was leaving Glenholm, going through to Burt, Rodney Peterson, he's with the RCMP. He was driving and he knew to be on the lookout for a possible decommissioned police car, but he wasn't quite sure about until much later in the morning that it was an RCMP car. And so he was driving, and this guy comes towards him, also in an RCMP cruiser, kind of driving a bit slow and smiling, and he's like, I think that's the guy. But the trouble was, with the way the road was designed, he couldn't turn around without possibly becoming a target himself and risking a big situation. So he had to, this was according to him, so he had to drive up the road about 1 kilometer to turn around, and by the time he turned around, the killer had left, and he didn't know where he'd gone. Now, Constables Melanson and Brown were also aware that they were supposed to be looking for possibly a guy in a vest like a Mountie, in a Mountie car. They had the correct information. They pulled up to the Onslow Fire Hall, where, you remember, Portapique evacuees were being, comforted and taken care of. So they race in. They see this guy standing with a vest on by a cruiser, which I believe was Constable Dave Gagnon. It could have been Westlake, that other fella, but he's not a Mountie, so I don't think he would have been wearing a vest. So probably Dave Gagnon. And he fired. They fired at them. Melanson and Brown fired at these guys. And then Gagnon hops on the radio and says, "Are you crazy? It's Gagnon. Like, look, it's me. Look at the number on my car." Like, that's because they knew the fake number that the guy had decaled on his car. He said, look at my car. I'm not the guy. Like, it's Gagnon. And they stopped, and thank God nobody was hurt. The fire trucks inside the Onslow Fire Hall, the fire truck's windshield was shattered, and already traumatized survivors had to hide under chairs and tables for an hour because nobody from the RCMP told them for an hour that it was an RCMP accident. So they were hiding in the Onslow Fire Hall for an hour thinking that the shooter was actively outside. Not to mention the shooter had driven by the Onslow Fire Hall earlier that morning, basically unnoticed by everyone but Westlake, who went, "Oh, that's weird," but didn't say anything to Gagnon. Which is, in retrospect, that's fair. Like, some of these things are fair, but a lot of them aren't. So there were several crime scenes where victims' families would come to the scene to figure out what was going on, and at times even spot their cadaver and had guns pointed at them and telling them to go home, not giving them any information, just guns pointed at them and go home. And some weren't informed hours later, that that's what had happened to their loved ones. Chad Morrison and Heidi Stevenson, this is a little bit more of just a tragedy of errors than anything that they did. Morrison was at a certain intersection. He was on he was at 2 and 224 of one intersection, and Heidi Stevenson thought it was 2 and 224 of another intersection. And the reason that he asked her to confirm what intersection she was at was because the killer was approaching in a cruiser, but he thought it was her. The killer got out of the car, shot at him, injured him, decided to rip off instead of finishing him off, which was remarkable. But basically, by that time, Heidi Stevenson had figured out something was wrong, managed to locate what sort of the general area where things were happening, was coming up an on-ramp, and then the killer crashed into her head-on and murdered her. And had she been seconds later or seconds sooner, it wouldn't have mattered, because the killer would have either kept going or, like, God knows what, like, he wouldn't have noticed her. So it was like almost a tragedy, that's how sick that tragedy was, is like it was just her timing. But I digress, back to where things went awry. Basically the Great Village Fire Hall, which is sort of near Glenholm, was being used as a command center of sorts for the Mounties. Now, this is another reminder of the gravity of the situation. In between 8 and 9 a.m. that morning, a picture was put up of that decoy cruiser. Again, the public did not find this out until 10:21 a.m., after which I believe 4 or 5 people had been murdered by then that morning. Like,
holy shit.
Before, like that were alive before that picture was put up, with the possible exception of Alana Jenkins and Sean McLeod, because they don't know roughly the time period of when they were killed. But it was between 6:30 or something and like 9 a.m. or maybe it was 6:50 and 9 a.m. And so it's devastating, because you have this picture that's the obvious key. You don't put it out until late. So one of the officers that was nearby but didn't have to go to the Onslow Fire Hall because he's a dog carrier. He was exempt from going to the command center as a dog carrier. I guess they have a little bit of discretion onto how they get to structure their day. So he was able to sort of chase the killer on his own accord. His name was Craig Hubley, and he was the guy who, starting his day in Onslow, or starting the morning in Onslow, eventually met up with the killer purely by chance at the Enfield Big Stop just outside of Halifax. It's a big truck stop and gas station, and he was filling up his car coincidentally, and the killer was filling up the stolen car, and he was able to shoot first and kill the gunman. Now this is after, like, kind of doing things his own way and not being involved with the chain of command at all. Now he was in the know, he did stop into Onslow, and he was in the know about what to look for and all of that stuff, but not all the guys were, and not all the information got to people in a timely manner. There was a lack of support for victims, people who were directly involved in the tragedy. Like victims or people who were like shot at, or like with the blue on blue shooting. Like I'm pretty sure it took one of the guys like didn't hear from RCMP Victim Services until like a year later. They had like an informal conversation with their senior officer, and it was apparently like he jokes that it took them longer to walk up the stairs to his office than to talk with him. Like it struck him as totally like not genuine. And then what was worse is as these families are all sort of rebuilding and putting together their lives, or trying to, they're pushing for a public inquiry to figure out how this can happen to their loved ones, and the federal and provincial governments, both liberal of the day, were stymieing them. And I don't know if that's because they were trying to protect the RCMP. I assume so because it's federal. But this public inquiry was able to go ahead after political pressure from numerous Nova Scotia members of parliament, including Liberals, who were like devastated at the possibility that the government would try to dive bomb this, which they tried to do. Eventually, it was allowed to go forward in place of what they tried to pass for an inquiry, which was some opaque review that they were going to do behind closed doors. But now this is a public inquiry. We're getting full transparency. And we're figuring out what went wrong here. And the reality is a lot went wrong. Like this guy, think about it. This guy was able to rampage from, and this is to formally invite you into the conversation now, Jacob. Think about what it was for this guy to be able to rampage from Portapique through central Nova Scotia, all down one of the most major highways in Nova Scotia, the 102 into Halifax, over the course of 2 days, killing 22 people, including several hours in which he just slept in Debert. How does that happen?
Well, it's remarkable, Liam. I mean, I have quite a few thoughts, but the first thought that was coming to my mind when you were describing that timeline of how early the RCMP received the information that there was a killer out, that he was in a replica police car. They received that information very early, yet it took them so long to convey that information to the public. Now, there are some that might claim, well, this is inevitable, that every bureaucratic system is the same way. That's not true. We saw in this case, it was the American embassy or the American authorities were sending out broadcast messages to Americans living in Nova Scotia, telling them that there was a killer on the loose, and telling them that they should lock themselves away hours before the RCMP said anything of the sort. So we know that
wow.
both us and the Americans, both us and the Americans have bureaucratic structures. Somehow the Americans were able to actually protect their people, and information security nature was able to filter up and out to the public faster. And if there's one other piece of information I'd like to add to your story, I've been reading. I have a global news story I was reading from November of 2020. No, October, sorry, of 2020. Said that the RCMP helicopter that services Atlantic, Canada, during that time was down for maintenance. So while the killer is sitting overnight in this field in the Burt, there could have been eyes in the sky over field looking for him, but the helicopter, the sole resource that the RCMP had for this, it was out of service. And if we think back in 2014, when there was a shooter in Moncton that killed, I think, 3 police officers, there was also public inquiry. One of the key recommendations of the public inquiry was to ensure that helicopters were not so commonly down for maintenance, to improve resourcing so that this would never happen again. And 6 years later, it happens again, and happens worse. So there's something seriously wrong here about one, how information filters from the bottom to the top in this organization, and two, how this organization responds to criticism, to challenges, to calls for reformation, because clearly it doesn't do that. It just bottles itself up. It finds a party line and changes nothing. To us, the Canadian people, our detriment.
Yeah.
And so I guess if we want to move the discussion, what we need to be talking about now is, what do we want going forward when there is a crisis like this? Because there are crazy people out there. We'll have the best gun laws. We can have great weapons laws. We can try to reduce this as much as possible, but there are going to be situations like this. How do we want a police force to respond? It seems we definitely need, at the beginning level, like more mental health support, more preventative policies like UBI. Like this guy, it seems like there was something mentally wrong with him, and it seemed also a history of spousal abuse in this relationship, where there could have been an early intervention.
He'd been arrested. He'd been arrested for assault, and like he had a little bit of a record. And people knew, like family members knew the relationship was toxic, but like every good toxic relationship in every family that has one, which is a lot, nobody ever wants to be the one to say something. And so it festers. And I think he was abused growing up. Like, I think his life had always been violence, and he was just a loose cannon waiting to, I don't think it was just that he was a loose cannon waiting to pop off. Like, that's the classic media line is, oh, he was just a loose cannon, and like he was a nice grandpa, or whatever the hell, the weird framing they give white people when they kill others.
Yeah, exactly.
And like, he was quiet, or he was whatever. No, he had been planning something for months, I believe, possibly even years. She was initially charged, his partner, for aiding and abetting, accessory to a crime, which is despicable because she's a battered spouse. And they eventually dropped those charges, thankfully, and she actually may even testify at the public inquiry at a future date. So that is going to be something, because we haven't heard from her at all directly, only through like whatever police statements there are, and that's kind of remarkable. But anyway, she, aided and abetted him, and she knew about it, and she told the officer, full light bar, full everything, like full everything. It's a replica police car. And so she knew. And one of the fellas so this is actually quite remarkable, is the Fisher family. And they're somewhere out there between Wentworth, Glenholm area. Like when he was murdering those people, he visited the Fisher family, and he had, I guess they were like acquaintances enough that they were friendly, and they'd done social things a few times. Like they went hunting once, and so at one point he was showing, during one of their visits, the killer was showing Fisher the replica police car. And not only did he have one, he had two apparently at the time. And he goes, "What are you doing? Like, why do you need to do that? Why would you want to build a replica police car?" And he goes, "Because I can." And he's like, "Okay, that's a little weird," but didn't think anything of it. And so he shows up to the Fisher place and knocks on the door, and then even tries to imitate the Mounties, like saying his own name and asking him to come out of the house with his hands up and stuff. And they're like, we're not letting you in. And bizarrely, instead of forcing his way into the house like he'd done with so many other instances, he walked away, got back into his cruiser, drove away. 5 minutes after, like 6 Mounties showed up. Like, I'm not laughing because it's funny. It's just like all of the near misses, and like nobody was communicating with one another. They'd be like, oh, okay, like the cops would be looking for him, thinking he was near Portapic because they hadn't heard anything since he was near Portapic. Oh, there's been a murder at 2328 Hunter, and oh no, so they head towards that place. Oh, there's been a murder up the road at this address. They're like, oh shit. Oh, he's spotted at this address or near this address. And they were always like on his tail, but and sometimes within minutes of him, but they just never quite were able to get to him until that chance meeting at Enfield. And they found out later that he was on his way to Halifax to get someone. And that identity hasn't been released. But police were sent to that house in Halifax to protect that individual. Apparently, up to 44 people had close encounters with him, and he planned to kill at least 5 more people. So it's the chain of command that I think plays a large role in this. Sometimes people don't really try their best to expedite the information because maybe they have five meetings that day, and maybe 3 of them are urgent, and they just can't get to approving something. But then that leaves everything in stasis. Everything is in stasis. And I don't know if that kind of communication would have gone up to the federal level. I think that was somebody, I remember reading that it was somebody in Nova Scotia, kind of within the RCMP bureaucracy, working kind of on the almost like conveying information side of things, like comms, yes, but also conveying information. And they went up the chain there at their level, and someone just decided that, for reasons that are, by the way, still unclear, hopefully this is something the inquiry will reveal, decided not to tweet the image of that replica police car until much later, despite Constable Stevenson suggesting it. So it's just extremely bizarre. It's just a sad case of bureaucracy leading to bad results. In this case, really bad results. I think I don't know if it's bureaucracy to blame for officers not knowing whether he was driving a white Ford Taurus, a decommissioned police car, a replica police car until much later than they should have. Certainly it's a chain of command thing. We don't even know which officers are responsible. Like, that's the thing. Like, we don't even know really kind of how far up this goes. And now numerous cops, there's the 3 cops that were first on scene in Portapique have been interviewed. There's going to be more cops that are going to be subpoenaed because, thankfully, like, as a public inquiry, the lawyers working for the public inquiry and on behalf of the families have the power to subpoena witnesses. So they can subpoena some of these guys, and I'm sure they will, and we'll find out more. But it's just looking to me like the necessary information got lost somewhere along the way. It's just sometimes what you think would be basic decision making doesn't really come across as basic decision making. It comes across as possibly incompetence.
Well, I'll give another theory there for you, Liam, because I think that this is less to do with just incompetence, but actually,
or deliberate. Is it deliberate?
I think a lot of it could be quite deliberate. Like,
in what sense, though? I'm curious to see if you have the same thoughts as me here.
If we're looking for what we want to see in the future, I think that it's a mindset where the police is understanding, particularly the RCMP, it's understanding that its role is to protect the people. And the way that the RCMP is operating in this case, it feels almost like they are an occupying military force, and they're treating the people as an enemy rather than as collaborators at the least, or as the people they're supposed to protect. So they're keeping information when they receive information like, there's someone in a replica police car. They're spreading it amongst officers, and they cause, like, there's an incident I was reading here that it was David Westlake that got shot at as well by the police.
Yes.
They're spreading the information to themselves but not to the public, when it's the public that's most at danger, but they're sort of privileging themselves in this position. And I think that there's a very clear reason for doing that.
Well, it's a deliberate part of the culture.
They don't want to hurt their image.
Right. Right. It's then protect
also
you first. Protect your butt first. And you talk about, like, putting, at all costs.
And you see, like, putting guns at the victims, pointing guns, just insane. But, like, pointing guns at the victims, and then taking this battered housewife families, and then charging her with a gun offense because, there needs to be a scapegoat. Someone needs to have a charge. So I guess it's going to be you. Sucks to suck that you. I guess you hope that you should have died instead. Like, it's your fault for living. Now you get to get a gun. Like, now you get a gun charge. Like, what the fuck were they thinking? That's just horrible. But that's like that. Everyone is the enemy to them, essentially. Then, so I think it's a very deliberate structure of events where they are keeping any information that could make them look bad, potentially, is getting locked in a sealed room, and even if it costs literal lives, they're not going to give that up. And that's something we need to change big time, because that's so dangerous to have a police force that thinks that way.
But it's not just the police force. Like, as you were saying, it's something that seems to be endemic to
pervasive in government
and pervasive in government in Canada. And it's like, I will protect my butt because at the end of the day, it's my butt that matters the most. Even though that, you know, lots of these government departments and agencies have mandates and things that say we're here to serve Canadians, or we're here to do this, or we're here to do that, and it sounds customer service oriented. When it comes to access to information in this country, we are abysmal compared to our peer countries at releasing even the most basic information. I've talked on this podcast before about years-long access to information waits for things as arcane as a memo from a meeting. You know, and the sad part is the default government view is, well, what kind of meeting? And like, why would that be any of their business? And sometimes like the principle of access to information is, it's not access to information for people who should be privy to it, unless it's like a national, like a security secret or something like that, or national secret or something like that. But it's like they almost deem everything, not literally deem everything a national secret, but effectively deem everything too secret for the public to know, for the sake of deeming it too public to know. Because, well, we're the ones that are privy to this. We're the ones that originally, you know, like, this pertains to us. Like, this isn't really the public's business, but it should be. A lot of that stuff should be the public's business, and that's like the very principle of doing it.
And politicians have developed a very bad habit in Canada of hiding behind that rhetoric of, oh, the investigation is ongoing, so we can't comment.
Or it's before the courts.
Leadership doesn't direct the police in Canada, so the police will do their job, but we have no role in oversight. I'm like, I'm sorry, but if the public is paying for it, if we're the ones getting shot, who the hell is in charge here? Is the police in charge of the police, or is the public in charge of the police? Like, at some point, we need to accept that the police are not their own boss. They need to someone needs to take control of this completely rudderless ship. And it's crazy that I have to say this, but it seems like no one's in freaking charge in this country.
No, I agree.
When it comes to our police forces,
Look at
or
the
our
convoy.
military force, or exactly. The convoy is a prime example of the police are just picking and choosing what laws they want to enforce or not enforce, and the politicians have nothing to say about that for some reason. Like, why is that an acceptable state of affairs? It makes no sense. And no, I understand that we don't want to live in a totalitarian Stalinist state where the prime minister is directing the commissioner of the RCMP to investigate in certain areas or not. But why is it so out there for Parliament to have oversight of who is hired and fired in the leadership of the RCMP, so that when someone fucks up like this, there are consequences for their actions? And when you have a police force that is consistently failing, whose officer corps seems to be filled with the absolute worst type of people. They're incompetent at best, or they're sexual harassers, and they're certainly racist at the absolute worst. Why are we impotent in reforming this service? It is insane that we accept this state of affairs in this country, and it needs to change. Absolutely.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's inconceivable that we've gotten to a place where 22 people can be killed because of, in some small part, a lack of transparency with an active mass murderer on the loose. It's just like, and I wouldn't be as critical if it was like they were finding things out as the public was. There were a lot of things that they knew in advance that they failed to inform the public about. The two most egregious of which is the replica police car, not telling people about that sooner, and the emergency broadcast system, which could have saved lives as well. And so that's the single biggest tool in the toolbook. And now they've started doing it. Like I was in a bar last week, and there was golf on the screen, and then this big emergency alert came on about these guys in Dartmouth who were armed. So it's like, okay, now you're using it. And so maybe that'll be part of the lessons learned. But I say lessons learned as a pun or a joke, because a lot of government departments make lessons learned and never look at them again. I mean, I don't think that was the only issue here. I think a big part of it was lack of communication, but part of that lack of communication was poor communication. That's an example of that for sure. Possibly at the expense of lives, and a lack of compassion for the families. Like the first thing that they wanted to do was cover their own butts, so they put a lot of pressure on the government, federal and provincial governments, to not let a public inquiry happen because they knew they were going to get dragged. But now, see, the problem with that is whenever you try to do things like that, people catch you, and then it adds onto the list of grievances. Yep. So now what we can add onto the list of grievances is they tried to snuff it out. And that was never going to happen. And it's now coming to light, thank God, so that hopefully this never happens again. And it's devastating to me that the families had to wait 2 years to convene this, to get it going. It took very long. Now, the commissioners had a huge task of compiling through a lot of crap and a non-compliant Mountie organization. Like, they handed stuff over eventually, but not without being dragged, kicking and screaming by their coattails. So they complied, and now we have a coherent inquiry and the ability to subpoena people and the ability to get the facts, I think. But public confidence, particularly in Nova Scotia here, has been really shaken by this. Really, really shaken. And those Nova Scotia MPs saw it coming and were able to stop it from it, get it to at least happen. But the even when it did happen, and it was delayed, and it was delayed, and it was delayed, and when it finally happened, people were worried that they were going to do a cover up for the Mounties, and now they're making an about face, and really looks like they're teeing up to drag the Mounties about what we're talking about on the show. And to bring it back to the general discussion, these are institutional issues, right? Like, I mean, God, the commissioner of the RCMP wouldn't even at first admit that she recognized systemic racism after a huge backlash.
Yeah.
All she was able to say before the backlash was that she'd heard multiple definitions and just kind of obfuscated from even sort of answering or acknowledging a problem, even though it's well documented in police forces. And there's just so much institutional rot in that organization, in the military, I know it's no wonder that public confidence is at a low watermark, 0. But then the gall, when it's that low, the gall for the Mounties' response to be, and the federal government's response to be, and the province's response to be, until they were dragged kicking and screaming, for their response to be opacity by default, is shocking to me. It's shocking to me that you've just had the worst mass shooting in the history of this country. He says he banned assault style firearms, but there were still so many that could easily be used in murders that he didn't ban. Mm-hmm. It was a political thing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I know it sounds good. It was a great soundbite. Everybody said, "Yay, Trudeau." He's not somebody who everything he's done is horrible, but that was a political stunt. That was not a real piece of policy. Then it was not seen as going far enough by advocates against gun violence. And so that's your response at the federal level. At the provincial level, the new premier down here, Tim Houston, progressive conservative, was like, come on, you guys, don't let the Mounties get away with this. Because he's kind of, I don't want to say he's innocent because he still represents the provincial government, but he's sort of like, he came in after the previous provincial government kind of tried to squash things. Like, that was the previous government under McNeil, Stephen McNeil, a liberal premier. And so it's just, but still, it's just like, the provincial government's just kind of cheerleading there in the background. The federal government had to be dragged kicking and screaming. The Mounties had to be dragged kicking and screaming. You'd think that you'd be eager to ensure it never happened again, but they seem eager to ensure that they salvage their own reputations, and that's what's disgusting to me. And the solution to that is what Jacob is suggesting, which is some sort of oversight over the RCMP, whether that's, I believe there's already a civilian oversight body that kind of is toothless, but it's there. But there needs to be some sort of legislative or like executive kind of thing, preferably legislative, that can and again, we're not policy experts with this stuff, but there has to be a solution here to look into this, to ensure the right people are getting hired, to cut some of this red tape. Like, we're progressives and we generally like government programs and social spending, but we don't like this kind of red tape. This kind of red tape is bad for democracy. At worst, it's bad for people's lives. Mm-hmm. And it's it's got to be addressed. We got to have some sort of tool, and we'd have to get a policy expert on the show to maybe look at what that tool exactly looks like, other than that maybe it would be a tool of Parliament to have some sort of oversight. But the reality is this sort of, well, it's not my problem, well, it's not my problem, well, it's not my problem, it just has to end. Because at some point, people want you to stand up for the thing, right? And they want you to take ownership of the thing. And it's like, well, that's not it's like, dude, no, we don't care. We elected you. And the same goes with political issues in general, by the way, listeners. Like housing, for example. We get it. Municipal governments have a lot of the say over zoning, a lot of the say over how houses get built in their respective municipalities on their respective lands. But if you're a federal government and you're saying, well, that's municipal, particularly if you're a progressive or a so-called progressive like Justin Trudeau, you cannot say, which he said the other day, nobody has a silver bullet to housing. And it's not because he's not right. He is right that there's no silver bullet to housing. But telling the thousands, if not millions of people who are looking for a home, the thousands of people who will probably at this point never be able to afford a home, when they ask you for policy solutions and the best you can do is pony up a TFSA for people that can already afford it, and you say there's no silver bullet, that's not good enough. You need to say, I'm the Prime Minister of this country, I am sort of the arbiter of the federal government, but I have the power to negotiate, so I will negotiate with the municipalities to knock down some of these barriers for you. He could, of his own accord. That's the thing, when everybody talks about, oh, that's their jurisdiction, that's that jurisdiction, like, okay, I make fun of politicians who promise a bunch of things that are out of their jurisdiction, but there's a way to go about it without, like, Jagmeet Singh made a promise that he was going to build more hospitals. It's like, no, you're not. Because that's not how that works. But if he had said, I'm going to negotiate with the provinces and territories to up the health transfer, people will go, great.
Exactly.
Or even if it's, I'm going to convene a roundtable of mayors to address housing needs. Great. Like, that's something that's within your power to do. You're not making a decision for the municipality, but you are convening a sort of a venue for it to be discussed. That is something that's within your power. That is how you make those changes. Otherwise, it's city councilors listening to people that like their view of the lake and don't want the condo blocking their view, so they don't want the condo built. And that is the reason we're in this problem.
Yeah, just because you are not controlling the whole solution doesn't mean that you cannot be part of the solution. And that is where our leaders absolutely abdicate responsibility. Like, if I can't get 100% credit for the actions I've taken, I'm not going to bother taking any action. That is what government by press release looks like, and it's failing this country.
It is, and it's I wish we had, like I said, I warned you listeners, this is going to be a heavy podcast, and it is, it's like of course, like on a world scale, Canada's done pretty okay, but that can't be the standard anymore. The standard can't be, well, we're better than the US. The standard can't be, well, at least we didn't elect Trump. Like, the reality is we have right now, particularly if you're listening right now, I imagine, maybe you're conservative. If you're listening, that's great. You're conservative. I'm surprised you're listening, that you've made it this far, but thanks for being here. If you're left-wing, which I imagine you are, progressive, it's obvious to you that there are now conservatives who are making comments like Pierre Poilievre, like Scott Aitchison, those are both conservative candidates for leadership, by the way. They both came out and they said, we gotta fight this red tape at the municipal level. And a bunch of people screamed at them, that's not your jurisdiction. Guess what? People don't care.
If there's a problem, there's a problem.
They don't care.
And they look to a leader to solve it.
They don't care. They just want to see you try to solve the thing. Exactly. They just want to see you solve the thing. They don't care who has to solve it. Solve it. Yeah. So if progressives' only response to guys like Scott and guys like Pierre is, that's not our jurisdiction, or there's no silver bullet. You've
never read the Constitution.
You are going to get... like, it's seriously though, like if you're a progressive and your response to Scott Aitchison and Pierre Poilievre is, we don't have a silver bullet, or that's not our jurisdiction, you are going to start to get, you are going to get clobbered, not only on that issue, but potentially in the general. You need to have a coherent response to this bureaucratic drag That's what I'm going to call it, because there's not really a term for it. Like, sure, bureaucratic inertia, but it's not even bureaucratic inertia. It's bureaucratic drag on everything, and it's becoming a symptom. It's almost like a nefarious, hidden symptom of our democracy that people outside the Ottawa bubble don't think about, and most of you listeners probably don't think about. But that's the reason a lot of stuff doesn't happen in this country as quickly as it could. There's a reason that people make fun of the bureaucracy, not because bureaucrats can't be great at what they do, but because the system in which they work in is so inherently inhibiting, particularly in this country. It's not a symptom of, I'm not saying that inherently the idea of public service is bad and is always an arm for the government to do whatever they want. It's the fact that some in the government begin to see themselves as just an arm of what the government of the day wants. You are an arm of what the government of the day is trying to do. You are an arm of the services and programs that government wants to put out. But that does not preclude you from upholding your ultimate duty, which is to Canadians. And the access to information was put in with the intention that it would be a way for Canadians to get information about what is going on. Similarly, at the municipal level, zoning laws were put in at a time where they were building big houses, big modern houses. This was in the 50s and 60s. They're getting their fancy cars, their big houses. Now we're trying to build up. We're not trying to build single-family homes anymore, but the municipalities are about 10 years behind. Yep. And the trouble is they're backed up by what people call NIMBYs, not in my backyard. Those are people who maybe there's a condo that they're trying to build a condo a block down the road from them, but they can't see, like I was saying earlier, maybe they see the lake and they don't want their view blocked. So they show up to the public meeting and oppose it. And then the councillors listen so they can get reelected. So then nothing gets built that's meaningful. And you can't get any information about anything half the time that happens at the city council, particularly around those kinds of meetings, because they're in camera. And some things have to be in camera for like solicitor-client reasons or whatever. Like there's reasons why things have to be in camera. But like I said, it's this tendency to be more opaque than we need to be or should be, because it's just easier. Like there's no other reason than it's just easier. Of course there's a risk in being more transparent. There's always a risk. But the reality is if the scandal's that big, they're going to find it. Yep. And you're going to be more embarrassed because they're going to see to what level you went to try to avoid it.
And the only narrative when you're being opaque, the only narrative that dominates is the conspiratorial narrative. Because all you'll get is these half rumors that are flying around. Like, for instance, I've even heard reporting on Canada Land, that famous sort of anti-Canadian media podcast of a former CBC employee that suggests,
Jesse Brown, right?
Yeah, he's been peddling a theory that the RCMP executed the killer in Portapique, that those RCMP guys didn't happen to be in the gas station, but that they followed the guy there to the gas station and killed him intentionally to avoid public scrutiny, so that we would never hear the other side of the story.
You mean like the fact that he was killed was deliberate?
Exactly,
for that reason.
they deliberate. So and when leadership just chooses to hide behind, the investigation is ongoing, or we can't comment, when you choose to not add your own narrative, whatever happens to be floating around in the ether becomes the central narrative. The only way that you can bring back any coherence to the discussion is if our leaders take control. And I think a lot of the reason why there's so much polarization, why our discussions seem so absolutely fucking insane all the time on social media, on our increasingly far-right radio stations, it's because our leaders refuse to say anything of any substance. They always are getting legal. Like, every lawyer's going to say, don't say anything, don't say anything. You can't do that, man. If you're a leader, you have to lead. It means you got to pick a story, and if you end up getting charged for that, or if you end up getting sued for that, fuck it. That's the cost of being a leader. You got to take risks. If you refuse to ever accept responsibility for your actions, you go nowhere. And I think to bring this back to the discussion of policing, trusting the RCMP to reform itself, it doesn't work. This is an organization whose its sole purpose was to remove Indigenous people from the West and sponsor and protect white settlers when they are moving into Western Canada. Its whole purpose, essentially, was a colonial purpose. And we have seen that there's a type of officer that is attracted to the RCMP, a very hyper-masculine, very racist officer that is, if not the dominant type, is a perpetually appearing type. And there's more than...
I would say the latter for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely more than enough evidence through rampant allegations of sexual assault, rampant allegations of racism and bullying to prove that there is a systemic hatred towards women and racial minorities in the RCMP. And we have more than enough Indigenous people in jail, well overrepresented, to know that if the RCMP isn't going around protecting people, it's still going around and locking up and suppressing people of color. That is its goal. And when the RCMP is asked to do anything else, when the RCMP is asked to police white people, when the RCMP is asked to protect people rather than just beat up people of color, it doesn't know what to do. Because that's not its job. The RCMP is designed to beat up people of color. When it's asked to do anything else, it can't function. Because it doesn't know what to do. It's outside of its job description. If we want to have a police force that doesn't do that, I think we need to build another one, or at least at the very least, we need to find those good officers and elevate them in the force. Because what we're doing right now, letting the police govern itself, it just ain't working, kids. It ain't working.
It's like letting the military govern itself. It doesn't work out too damn well.
But I do think the left-wing rhetoric of defunding the police probably doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It seems like we're talking about that helicopter that was under maintenance at the time, and there's like a wave of crime in the rural areas of Alberta where I'm from, where the RCMP is just completely inept and under-resourced in finding and solving property theft. It seems that there is a real lack of resources in this area, and defunding the police makes it worse. Certainly, as I can attest to in rural Alberta, when the RCMP retreats, all those armed farmers just take the foreground and they start organizing their own militia, essentially, to protect themselves. Completely retreating from the police discussion is not, I don't think that's an acceptable progressive strategy. We want to build our own model of police. It can't just be as simple as defund the police, remove the police. I think it needs to be, the discussion needs to move at what is a good model of policing? What is the ideal police that we like? So that if there are people in the RCMP that hate this culture, that hate the sexism, the racism, which there are, they need to have a model that they can move towards. Because right now the left is saying, we hate the police, so that we want to defund the police. So even if you are a good police officer in the RCMP, you feel like you have no other camp but the RCMP. You have to defend this indefensible organization because the left seems like they don't have your back, essentially. So you're put up against a wall. You're forced to defend people that you really don't want to defend. Whereas if we created a model police, if we said, these are bad police and these are good police, be the good police, I think that there are more than enough members in the RCMP who would choose to walk across that bridge and be the good police. It's not about defunding the police, it's about defunding this police and building a new one. That's what I would recommend.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that's the thing is, like, a lot of people are going to be mad at me for this, but I don't care, because I have principles, and, like, I struggle with saying all cops are bastards, because, like any absolute, it's just not... No. I do agree that all cops...
deals in absolutes.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Nice, very nice.
Very nice.
I do like to note that to some level or another, all cops are part of a system that is inherently oppressive and needs reform. That is true. Are all cops bastards? What's your definition of bastard? Like, when I think of a bastard, I think of an asshole. Are they all assholes who don't care about serving the public? Probably not. I'm sure there's at least a handful who want to serve the public and who want to try to do a good job, but either because of the institution hold incorrect or morally wrong even ideas about how to deal with problems, or maybe they don't. Maybe they want to police a certain way, but within the institutional structure and constraints, they can't police the way they want because the chain of command is ineffective, or it's hyper masculine, and there's no progression on relations with BIPOC communities or LGBTQ communities or whatever. And I don't want to say there's been no progression, but like, my gosh, we're still hearing about like overrepresentation of Indigenous prisoners in our prison system, which, by the way, is another whole discussion in itself because they're antiquated, at times over 100 years old, rife with COVID, and arguably inhumane, and we have dozens of people per year in structured intervention units, which are essentially the old solitary confinement chambers that the Trudeau government was asked to stop using. So they slap a new can of paint on, put a poster up, and put people in there, and it's been the same level of trauma to the point where it actually violates the United Nations definition of torture.
Nicer, friendlier torture, essentially. Yeah.
Nicer, friendlier torture with a smile and a poster and a new can of paint. And so, there's a lot that needs to be reformed within our justice system. There's a lot that needs to be reformed within our policing. And we obviously need some sort of an entity there, some sort of a civic entity to sort of serve in that role. I do think it is possible to defund certain elements of the police. I think it's possible to back them away from mental health calls, where they often have no idea what they're getting themselves into and people wind up dead. I think it's dangerous. I think it's tricky in situations where maybe the person who that they're responding to is armed. Obviously, they have to take some sort of precaution, but at a minimum, they should be accompanied by a mental health expert. At a maximum, if the person is unarmed, if they're just in distress, they should just send a mental health worker and possibly a plainclothes officer, or maybe even a plainclothes special constable or somebody that's not as intimidating, because those are pretty heavy calls. And I think moving officers away, moving them off that beat and onto other things. I think, city council saying no when forces ask for their armored trucks, like things like that, like saying no when they ask for tech they don't need. And maybe that's why police boards are supposed to exist in municipalities for oversight. They're not supposed to be a rubber stamp. They're supposed to do oversight into what the officers need. And part of that is listening to policing experts who do exist, but they can tell you what kind of equipment officers might need and equipment that they might not need. The Halifax Regional Police, for example, tried to get an armored vehicle. I'm pretty sure the council luckily decided to say no, but those are ways we can save money and redirect municipal money towards other things. On the federal level, we're going to have to take a hard, long look at what we want the RCMP to be. Provincial police forces should be doing the same look inward. The OPP are notoriously issue-ridden as well in Ontario Provincial Police. And it's, I'm like, here I go being Trudeau, but it isn't a silver bullet. But my God, you have to look like you're making some progress here on policing, on government transparency, which ties right into it, on justice reform, which ties right into it. But the trouble is that governments are in and out so fast, and at worst don't realize that they're supposed to be governing, and then these issues go to the wayside. And there's a lot of issues, particularly now, that are just dominated by bureaucrats. With I don't want to say little to no oversight, but little to no idea. The minister has little to no idea what's going on at the granular level. Of course, they get briefed. They have a high level briefings. I'm sure they even have granular briefings. But like, my God, I'm certain that there's some departments where ministers don't even know what is going on, or at worst, they know what is going on. For example, I think that Correctional Services Canada was well aware of its issues with structured intervention units, was well aware that they had incomplete and missing data sets, was well aware of what it was doing in trying to stymie the work of the auditors who were brought in to try and solve that situation. And Justin Ling, you can check out freelance journalist Justin Ling. He has great reporting on this, on Canada's prison reform issues, or lack thereof, I should say. And all of this just feeds this bureaucratic drag that Jacob and I are talking about. But with policing, you've got to bring it back to the left. You've got to seize it as an issue for the left. The left likes to kind of throw their hands up and go, well, police bad, but like they won't really like say what they want to replace or change. So this is our opportunity to fill that void as progressives. Now, how can we do that? How can we do that in face of the challenges right now, aka the bureaucratic drag, the political climate? How do we succeed? What do you think, Jacob?
Well, I do think that it starts with politicians taking a larger role in the policing discussion. If there's a huge force that contributes to this bureaucratic drag, it's that there is no ideology that sort of governs police forces right now. As I said, the RCMP, it was a colonial enterprise. So back in the old days when it was acceptable to just go around mugging perfectly innocent Indigenous people, the RCMP knew what they needed to do. No one needed to tell the RCMP to lock away Indigenous people. They understood what their role was. Now, I think everyone is sort of aware that that's unacceptable, so they still do it, but they don't do it as much. And essentially, they're only going to do their job when they're told to do their job, because they haven't really had a new narrative take hold in the police. The police know, because they've heard the cultural conversation, they know that they shouldn't be attacking people of color, but they don't know any other way of actually doing their job. Because that's the whole model that the force was built to do. That all this criminology field is sort of premised around. They have no sense of any other way that they can be using their force and their resources at their disposal to make a positive benefit to society. They're just aware that their inclinations are often harmful, so they essentially try to do as little as possible, and this is the result. If you want a response to bureaucratic inertia, you need to give someone a story. You need to give someone a raison d'etre, so that when they're not being given constant and direct orders, they actually know what they should be doing in their downtime. And that is a politician's job. It's a politician's job to be saying, this is our vision. This is where we think police can add to the discussion. This is my view for what a good police officer looks like, for how police are integrated into the community, for how police ensure public order and safety without murdering innocent people of color, without locking Indigenous people in prison. And that's where our politicians have really been missing in action. They're hiding under it's not the politician's job to direct the police. And I'm sorry, but that's just not an acceptable excuse anymore. You need to be more creative. You need to say, this is what we want out of the police. I think the police are sort of sitting around because they know that they're wanted, but they don't know how they're wanted. And they know that what they're trained to do isn't socially acceptable anymore. There's a bunch of police, I have the feeling there's a bunch of really good people that are in uniform, but they don't really know what to do because no one's telling them what to do anymore. And so you end up with this bureaucratic inertia where you're just sitting around, like sitting on your hands, because you have no idea what you're supposed to be doing with your guns and handcuffs. And that is where the politicians need to be you need to be replacing those guns and handcuffs with new tools. And you need to be showing them how those tools can be deployed. That's all in the realm of acceptable political discourse, but our politicians are avoiding it for some reason. And I don't think we can accept it much longer.
We only hope that, at some point, I saw a great tweet, and I actually meant to send it to you, Jacob. It was a David Moskrop tweet, and it said that basically progressives, the left, really badly needs a firebrand politician to respond to the populist sentiment of the moment, and otherwise we're going to be screwed. And it reminded me of the private discussion you and I were having about kind of where the left needs to go, and I think that this discussion we had tonight has shades of that in terms of on the specific issue of policing, and this is what Speech from the Throne aims to do, ladies and gentlemen. We're trying to sort of float possible progressive solutions to the policy issues of the day. And we thank you for joining us on this one, even though it's sort of a heavier one. If you've made it this far, thank you. We appreciate you. And we'd like to dedicate this episode to the 22 victims of the 2020 Nova Scotia shootings and their families and friends and loved ones. And we hope that you follow along with the public inquiry as it continues. It's masscasualtycommission.ca. That's masscasualtycommission.ca. You can find the list of proceedings, the calendar, the webcast link, all that stuff there. And until next week, we will see you. Take good care. If you like what you heard, if you hated what you heard, if you have a point to make, if you have a comment, a question, whatever, send it to speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. That's speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. And have yourself a wonderful rest of your week.